Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this TILE seminar. It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Chelsea Robertson to you today. She's an assistant professor of psychology at the West Liberty University in West Virginia. Today she's going to talk about trauma-informed education and promoting resilience in the classroom. She received her PhD in experimental psychology from East Tennessee State University in 2021 and is currently an assistant professor of psychology at West Liberty University located in northern West Virginia. Her primary research interests include early adversity and trauma resilience informed teaching in the post-secondary classroom. Right, I'm going to pass over to Chelsea to take the floor. And again, any questions you might have, please put them in the chat, and Chelsea will reply to them at the end of the talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. As I was talking earlier before we started this, before we started letting people in, this is one of my most favorite things to talk about, at least academically. So I'm very excited to be here today. Now, are you all able to see my slides? Perfect. Love when technology works. So today I'm going to be speaking on implementing trauma-informed teaching practices in the classroom. So as was previously mentioned, I'm a second-year faculty member at West Liberty University in Northern West Virginia. So situated right here in the beautiful Appalachian Mountain Range. A very small school, but it's definitely become home to me in the past couple of years. So my background is in experimental psychology. Which means that I am a researcher. I'm not a clinician. People tend to think that psychology equals you see clients. I have never seen a client in my life, and I don't plan to. I respect people who can and who do. That is just not really my thing. I'm more into the behind the scenes doing research and statistics kind of thing. So as also was previously mentioned, I'm very interested in topics like early adversity and resilience, trauma-informed pedagogy, and just overall best teaching practices. So when it comes down to talking about trauma, this is one of those things that I have run into myself as a psychology instructor. A lot of times we talk about things that people already kind of know about, but they maybe can't define. Like we all kind of know what trauma is, at least in some regard. But what I find is that oftentimes a lot of people, they may know what it is, but they may not be able to really describe what it is. So something that I kind of like to start out these talks doing is just saying that first off, trauma is incredibly common. I think that it is a common misconception that it's this rare thing that happens to a very small subset of people. It's actually incredibly common. Here in the United States, we can expect 70% of adults or more reporting at least having one traumatic experience in their lives. So that is a pretty high number that often surprises people. Something else that we know about trauma is that it has widespread effects on individuals' developmental trajectories. So that can mean things like academically, socially, your ability to regulate your emotions, your ability to engage in cognition. Those are all going to be affected as a result of trauma, specifically early trauma, but all trauma nonetheless. We also know this is kind of a big point to make is that even though trauma has these really widespread effects on how people live and develop, they can still be mitigated even decades later, and especially in educational settings. This is one of those things where I believe that instructors, all the way from, daycare through preschool, through post-secondary education, we are in a perfect position to help mitigate the effects of trauma. So that's kind of why I'm here today, to talk through this topic. So getting into the specific definition of trauma, I feel like with trauma, if you ask 50 people what their definition of trauma is, you'll probably get about 45 different responses. It's one of those things, again, where we all kind of know what we're talking about, but we don't really know what we're all talking about. So this is the overall definition that I like to use. This is through SAMSA, so the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is actually a part of the United States Department of Health and Human Services. So it is kind of more United States based, but I think it is a very nice encompassing definition. So this is related to the 3 E's of trauma, according to SAMSA. So individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances. So it can be varied for everybody that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So I like that definition because it talks about how, one, trauma is varied. It depends on your own experience of the trauma. It could encapsulate just one traumatic event. It can encapsulate a series of traumatic events. And it talks about how trauma has just this overarching effect on so many areas of our lives. Now, the type of trauma that I like to think I'm more of a specialist in, which is always so strange for me to say, is adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This is I would consider this to be one of the biggest public health crises in the United States, if not the entire world. Just because this is one very powerful type of trauma, because it specifically occurs in childhood. It occurs when we know that all of our brains are developing, when we are developing those very essential skills that are going to help us later on in life. Um, so the researcher, or the group of researchers who came up with this, was Felitti et al. And what they did was they assessed the prevalence of 3 categories of ACEs in over 17,000 adults in San Diego, California. Um, that is a massive sample size. That is incredibly large. That is just an astronomical amount of participants in this single study. And what they found were a couple of things. Um, well, before I get into those findings, let's get into a little bit about what ACEs are. So there are 3 groups of ACEs that are traditionally thought of. This original ACEs questionnaire was expanded, and so it now incorporates other things, other types of early trauma that are not listed here. But these are the 3 types of ACEs that we typically see. So we see abuse, so physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. We see physical or emotional neglect. And then the 5 other ones are just general household dysfunction. So things like mental illness in the home, having an incarcerated relative, experiencing abuse towards a caregiver or a parent, and then substance abuse or separated or divorced parents. And so out of the 17,000 adults that were surveyed in this original ACEs study, there were 2 really big findings that were discovered as a result of just this massive data set that was collected. The first one was that ACEs were found to be incredibly common. So again, about 70% of participants reported at least one ACE, and about 1 in 5 participants reported exposure to 4 or more ACEs. So this was quite alarming to those researchers, because this was in a sample that was primarily white, primarily educated. They were all collected through an insurance group, so they all had insurance. This was quite astounding. We're seeing these numbers even in that particular demographic. And similar prevalence rates have been found in expanded studies with more diverse samples, if not more prevalence rates. So that was kind of the first major finding of the original ACEs study. The second finding was probably a bit more scary just because of its implications. The researchers found that the more ACEs someone experienced, so all of this trauma that they experienced as a child, their risk for several health problems increased, even decades later. Some of these participants were in their 50s and 60s, and these things had happened to them decades prior, and they still had these increased health risks. So some physical health problems that we saw increase were ischemic heart disease, chronic lung disease, cancer, um, increased risk of diabetes, you name it, they probably had an increased risk of that particular condition. Mental health problems, we saw an increase of depression, suicidality, substance abuse, etc. And so sometimes people are like, well, if you had a rough childhood, that means that you're probably more likely to go into things like maybe not being super active. You might be more likely to engage in more drinking or more drug use, and you might be less likely to go to a doctor. Um, these findings were still found even after controlling for those risky health behaviors. And that was kind of the part that really stood out to the researchers of like, oh, this is something really serious that we have discovered. So, kind of turning more into the impact of ACEs on education, we know that students with trauma histories, they face a lot of unique difficulties that students without trauma histories may not necessarily deal with on such a wide scale. So, research has indicated that they have several affected skills like learning, executive function, memory, emotion regulation, social skills, and we see how all of those kind of intermingle with each other. If one's affected, the others are probably affected too. We also know that students with trauma histories are more likely to score lower on standardized tests. They are more likely to face disciplinary action, and they're even more likely to be retained or to be held back for a grade or even more. So, pretty significant findings in the education realm. I am a college instructor, and so this is kind of more of my particular arena that I am more knowledgeable about the research about. So we also know that in college students, ACEs are also very common. Depending on the study, you'll see anywhere between about 50 and 60% of participants who have at least one ACE, and then about 12.4% of college students with 4 or more ACEs. So again, dealing with those very big numbers here. We also know that students at post-secondary institutions who do have high ACE scores are less likely to graduate from that institution. And there's a lot of speculation as to why this happens, but most of the literature points to those physical and mental health problems, and then just in general family issues that they're having to deal with on top of school, on top of other obligations that they have. And so, knowing this and knowing the effect that ACEs has on development, all organizations, including schools and universities, can and should be trauma informed. And that is simply because all students, not just those who have been affected by trauma, can benefit from attending institutions that promote resilience. So, knowing all of this, when this research came out with Felitti et al. In the late 90s and kind of in the early thousands, there was this question of, well, where do we go from here? Like, we know that this is bad, we know that these effects are happening, but how can we help? You know, we're dealing with things that happened decades ago. How can we possibly mitigate these effects decades later? And it's really through trauma informed care, which implements a trauma informed approach. And this essentially means that we view others through almost like a lens of adversity. So if you wear glasses, you wake up in the morning, you see kind of blurry. You might see blobs, you might see some shapes, but it's not until you put your glasses on that you can really start to see your surroundings. And we view trauma informed care the same way. You put your trauma informed lenses on, and instead of seeing these blobs of behavior and these blobs of effects that students deal with, you're more able to clearly view what's actually going on. So we know that behavior is viewed in light of trauma's far reaching implications. This is also where I like to point out, this is kind of about the point of, at least when I do in person presentations, people are like, I am not skilled in therapy. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not equipped to deal with that. And I say, well, me neither. I'm not a clinician. I'm a psychologist, but I'm not a practicing clinician. There's a pretty common quote amongst the trauma-informed care community that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. You can still help people even without having those credentials, even without having that experience. Once you adopt this trauma-informed lens, it is much easier and it becomes a lot more natural for you to do this even without having to be a clinical individual. So we know that trauma-informed care is kind of this movement towards recognizing the effects of trauma and also working with these traumatized individuals to help their developmental trajectories. But a big part of trauma-informed care is promoting resilience. And that's also kind of one of those things that I think we can all have our own definition of. We know it when we see it, but we maybe can't come up with a very clear definition that we all agree on. However, we know that teachers and instructors are in a very unique position to do this. So getting a little bit more into resilience. If you have ever heard of the term pick yourself up by your bootstraps, that's kind of what most people tend to think of as being resilient or having resilience. However, the literature and a lot of people in the trauma-informed care and a lot of this resilience promoting these areas of research, they typically agree that resilience does not solely reside within an individual. There are some individual characteristics that can promote resilience. However, it is thought that resilience is largely determined by an individual's social support. Um, so I kind of use the example of lifting yourself up by your bootstraps. What if you don't have boots to begin with? Your social supports are going to help you get those boots in the first place so that those individual characteristics that you have can come more to the forefront. And so this means when we have strong social support, that means that we can have people who have trauma backgrounds, but who are able to have mitigated adverse outcomes. But we also know that having strong social supports is good for everybody, regardless of trauma history or trauma experience. So it's not just for traumatized students, it's going to be for every single student that you come across. And that is simply because in psychology, we know that all humans have these basic psychosocial needs. So, security, being able to feel safe in your environment, belongingness, so being able to feel as though you belong, and the formation of meaningful relationships with others. And that's really at the heart of trauma informed care. That's at the heart of promoting resilience. That's at the heart of everything that we need to do to mitigate these effects of ACEs. So, kind of the bulk of what I wanted to talk about today is SAMSA's Pillars of Trauma Informed Care. So, again, this is more of a US based program as far as I am aware. But this is something that I have seen be promoted in a lot of these trauma informed care circles. Um, so as of right now, as of the way that our field is, we currently don't have a single globally accepted set of recommendations on how to be trauma informed or how to promote resilience. But this is one of those situations where we all kind of know what we're looking for. Like we can all go into a classroom and say, yeah, that teacher is probably being trauma informed. But in terms of a very unified operationalization of trauma informed care, I like talking about SAMHSA's 6 pillars because they are currently considered, at least in the circles that I have been exposed to in my career, they are considered to be the gold standard. And so we know that these pillars are going to not give specific recommendations. They're going to give specific recommendations in regard to how you should think about your interactions with others. So it's not like a checklist that you follow. It's more of, again, shifting your focus from not being trauma informed to being trauma informed to being resilience informed. And so these all are directed towards the question, how do we promote resilience? So these are the 6 pillars of trauma-informed care according to SAMSA. Um, So the first one that we have is promoting physical and psychological safety. You cannot be trauma informed if, for example, students are terrified to come into your classroom because they think that you're going to yell at them for some reason or another. A campus can't be considered physically safe if there's not adequate lighting around campus. We also know that conducting operations with transparency to build trust, that's going to be pillar number two. So basically letting people know as much as they can, like within reason. Oftentimes not everything can be shared with everyone all the time, but being able to conduct as many operations as you can with transparency, letting people what's going on behind the scenes, especially when it affects them. Establishing systems of peer support. No person is an island. Everyone is able to access other people who are there to support them. People are interacting with each other. Different departments are going to be interacting with each other. Encouraging collaboration, again, kind of going along with point number three. So encouraging those discussions among peers who maybe don't always interact with each other. Something as simple as building in these. I think at my university, we actually have like a peer support group for incoming faculty who are partnered with an older faculty member who has been there for a little bit longer. So things of that nature, and encouraging that sort of collaboration. Recognizing power differentials and promoting empowerment, voice, and choice. So this is something that is particularly important in the classroom because those of us at the head of the classroom, those of us who are in control of the grade book, we inherently have a power differential going on. We have power differentials with students. Our department chairs have power differentials with us. Deans have power differentials with department chairs. Principals have power differentials with their faculty members. So just recognizing that, but then also encouraging everyone, no matter what their role is at an institution, to share their opinions, to share their voice, and to allow them to share those things that otherwise they may be a little bit more hesitant to share. And then finally, actively dismantling oppressive systems. Something I like to say is you can't be trauma informed if you are perpetuating racism, misogyny, transphobia. That just kind of goes in the exact opposite direction of trauma informed care. That could be a whole talk in itself, is just all of those things that we have to keep in mind, all of those isms and phobias that we unfortunately have to deal with sometimes. So those are, in general, the 6 principles of trauma-informed care, according to SAMSA. Now, taking a bit of a shift here, this is actually something that I did as part of my dissertation back in 2021. So I was interested in how can we implement these 6 principles in education. And there wasn't really a clear answer. This is still a relatively new area, at least in terms of how we can promote this in pedagogy, how we can promote these practices in the classroom. But I came across this citation. So Wolpo et al. In 2009, they came up with this idea of compassionate teaching practices. And the more I was reading, I was like, oh, this is a pretty good conceptualization of how we can be trauma informed. They didn't necessarily use this word trauma informed very much. However, it maps very nicely onto those SAMSA pillars. We're going to get into that a little bit more in a second. So this was originally developed for K through 12 education, but I can argue that these can still be adapted for higher education. You just have to tweak them a little bit and they will still fit very nicely. So as I mentioned, these are 6 general practices that can promote resilience in all students. And I think that they align quite nicely with the 6 pillars of trauma-informed care. So here's kind of how I envision them mapping onto each other. Now, I'm going to go into more detail about these compassionate teaching practices. But as I was working on my dissertation, I was like, oh, that sounds exactly like this particular pillar. This one can maybe encapsulate 2 pillars. So there is a lot of overlap, at least in my view, between the SAMSA pillars of trauma-informed care and compassionate teaching practices promoted by Wolpo et al. So going more into these compassionate teaching practices, you'll see that there are some general guidelines that um, are considered best practices for instructors to follow. Again, it's not quite like a checklist of, okay, here's what I do on day one, here's what I do every day. These are more aligned with more of a paradigm shift rather than a checklist that you're supposed to do every day. So let's get into a little bit more about compassionate teaching practices. The first one, proposed by Wolpo et al., is always empower, never disempower. So again, we're talking about those power differentials, and we're talking about avoiding triggering feelings of powerlessness. Something I always like to do is, I'm sure that we've all had that one teacher who we went to, maybe we were a child, or maybe it was as late as college or grad school, and you were just so scared of them. It's like, I really need help on this subject, but I'm just so terrified of what they're going to say to me, how they're going to react to me asking for help. And we can maybe assume that they weren't following this recognizing power differentials and not triggering those feelings of powerlessness. So some suggestions that I have and what the literature has to help with this particular practice is to have something as simple as a predictable routine. Um, so something like a thorough syllabus where students generally know, okay, I kind of know when my exams are coming up. I know what is expected of me every week, or something as simple as a classroom routine. Okay, the first 5 minutes every day, we're going to do this. We're going to end with this on every day. It doesn't mean that you don't have any room for those things that come up when you're teaching. It just means that students generally know, okay, when I walk into this classroom, I generally know what's going to happen. Also, something like communicating changes well in advance if possible. Of course, emergencies happen, but if you know that you're going to have to move an exam back, or you're going to have to postpone it, let the students know as soon as possible. Something as simple as that can help avoid triggering those feelings of powerlessness. Something that I like to do, and something that I think could easily be implemented in the higher grade levels, would be checking in with students as early as possible in the semester or in the school year. So I actually use a student information questionnaire that I get a lot of information from students. You know, I ask about their major, I ask what year in college they are, but towards the end, I ask them something along the lines of, what can I do to support you in this class? Or is there anything else you want me to know? I primarily teach research methods and statistics, which absolutely terrify students. And so this is kind of a way for me to gauge how they feel about the class before we even start lecture on day one. So those are some things that we can use in as far as empowering but avoiding disempowering students. We can also use early feedback, so welcoming and utilizing early feedback. Something that I do is on the first exam in my class, which is usually about 3 or 4 weeks into the semester, I will offer extra credit for students who tell me what they like about the class and what are some things they would change within reason. And I tell them, I will give you the credit no matter what you say. As long as you give me something, you will get the credit. I'll actually give you the credit before I even read them, just so that you know that I want that feedback from you. And I'm not just looking for compliments, and I'm not just looking to hear about the good things. I want to hear your true opinion. Also, giving reasoning behind decisions and policies. So if you don't allow technology in the classroom, go into why, other than, well, just because I said so. When a student hears that, they might be thinking, okay, you're kind of the authority figure. You are the person who is going to be in charge, and there's not going to be really any room for open discussion in this course. So something as simple as just giving your reasoning. It doesn't mean that students have to like it. It doesn't mean that you are able to change it as a result of their feedback, but just giving the why is going to be very powerful. And then finally, being aware of social, cultural, historical, and gender issues. Again, avoiding perpetuating those stereotypes, prejudices, and biases. Again, cannot be trauma informed if you are perpetuating those. Next up is providing unconditional positive regard. So this means that you can establish a sense of trust by displaying sustained and genuine kindness, respect, and empathy. I think that sometimes people tend to think of this as saying, oh, well, I'm supposed to praise every student for every single thing that they do. And that's not the case. Praise them in a genuine way. Even if they get an answer wrong, like if you ask a question in class and you say, oh, what's the answer to this problem? And they get it wrong, don't say, oh, that's such a great job. I mean, you did it wrong, but like, that's a great job. You can shift your focus to say, I'm glad that you thought through it. I'm glad that you raised your hand. I'm glad to hear from you. Something as simple as that can be quite helpful. So every day is a new day, every semester a new semester, and every year is a new year. So students can often think, well, I didn't do so well in your class last week. Um, Maybe you're going to hold kind of a grudge against me, but communicating to students that every day's a new day, we're going to try this again. We're going to see what we can do to move on from here. We also know that students' experiences outside of the classrooms influence their performance inside them. So if I have students for a standard 50-minute class 3 days a week, I see them for less than 2% of their overall week. But I know that the remaining 98% of their time that is not in my classroom is going to affect their performance in my classroom. Whether I am aware of it or not, that is going to be what happens. And so just kind of keeping that in mind when you're interacting with students as well. We also know that just having good teacher-student relationships, that is noted to be one very big protective factor. We know that people, or especially children who have at least one safe, stable, and caring adult are going to have such better outcomes, even if they have a very high ACE count compared to a student with maybe lower ACEs who doesn't have that adult that they can go to. Maintaining high expectations. This is something that I often sometimes get a little bit of pushback. Like I see the suspicious looking looks when I talk about trauma-informed teaching because people think, well, you're just asking me to be a doormat. Like I can't discipline students. I can't give grades that they rightfully earned. And I say, no, trauma-informed teaching is exactly the opposite. You maintain those high expectations because if you don't, students are going to pick up on that. They might feel that you have inadvertently given up on them. And maintaining high expectations still leaves room for compassion. As I mentioned before, I primarily teach research methods and statistics, the kind of scary classes in the department. And I tell students, I'm not going to water down the material for you. I will explain as many times as needed. I will do whatever it takes to teach you this, but I know you can do it. And I'm going to hold you to that because I know that you can do this. This is probably my favorite compassionate teaching practice. So check assumptions, observe, and question. This was probably the biggest one for me because I think as teachers, we often see student behavior and we want to take it so personally. Like a student is always showing up late, they turn in their homework late, they're just doing all of these behaviors, and you're just like, they don't care about my class. They couldn't care any less about what I'm teaching them. But going from that to saying there might be something else going on with that student. Of course, it could just be they didn't do their homework on time. It could be that they just overslept. But what if it was something different? And so becoming trauma informed necessitates another perspective shift where we go from what's wrong with you to what happened to you to what's right with you. So maybe even though this student isn't very engaged, they turn in their homework late. But when they do turn in their homework late, it is phenomenal. It is such high level work. Keeping that in mind of just because there are things that maybe frustrate us about our jobs or frustrate us about interactions with students, always kind of keeping the what's right with you in the back of our mind. And just having this idea that behaviors could indicate something other than what is first assumed. So this is where I like to show an example of a tweet that I came across a couple years ago. And I said, yes, this is exactly what I was looking for. So Heather Thompson Day, who is an educator I found on Twitter, said that I had a student who was late to class come up to me afterwards. He said, "I'm sorry I was late. My mom died this morning and I didn't know where to go, so I came here." And that was the day that I decided to treat every single student as if I have no idea what they're going through. So you can imagine in her position, what if she would have berated that student coming in? That would have just made an awful situation even worse for them. And that probably could have really ruined that relationship that that student had with her. So, very powerful example of what we're talking about here. Next up is be a relationship coach. So we all know that our classes don't just encompass the actual curriculum and the actual learning objectives that we are trying to promote in our classes. We also know that we're teaching them things like how do you interact with other people? How do you make mistakes and how do you apologize for making those? How do you just navigate the world of interacting with other humans, which can be really complicated sometimes. So, as an instructor, you are in a really good position to, when you make mistakes, because they are going to happen, apologize for them. Giving and receiving praise and constructive criticism, and giving encouragement. Again, not giving it so that it's overkill, but giving it in very genuine amounts, giving it in situations where it is certainly going to help that student out. Next up is provide opportunities for helpful participation. So this is something that I think we saw a lot of during the height of the COVID pandemic. At least for me, I was teaching online at the time, and I just kept on hearing from students, I just wish that I could be in the classroom again. I just wish that I could be with my friends and with my peers. I just want to feel as though I belong instead of just being a face on a screen. And so this is always one of those pillars that I think back to during the height of the pandemic. So this would really entail providing opportunities for meaningful engagement and showing students that they are valued. And so that can help them have a sense of belongingness in the classroom, department, university, school system, whatever it may be. So something as simple as holding space for discussion after you come back from a break and say, how was your winter break? Tell me about it. Tell me something awesome that you did this weekend. What is your opinion on having pineapple on pizza? That one always gets my students going. So something as simple as that maybe isn't directly related to the curriculum, but it's going to help build that sense of community. Encouraging collaboration in and out of class, again, giving genuine praise, and then welcoming mistakes and supporting students through the learning process. So again, teaching statistics, you're going to make mistakes. It's a hard topic. And I tell students, I welcome them. I mean, I I want to be able to help you through those mistakes because I know they're going to happen and it's okay that they happen. This is how you learn. You first make the mistake, we're going to help get you through it, and then we're going to move forward. So, ultimately, to wrap up, two main points that I want to leave you with today is first that trauma is common, varied, and impactful. However, the effects of trauma can be mitigated at all educational levels, anywhere from preschool all the way up to post secondary, postgraduate education. And I also want to leave you with this idea that while not all students have been exposed to trauma, all students can benefit from having instructors who are trauma informed and resilience focused. So that is going to have me wrap up there. I have my email up here in case you would like to chat about this some more. This is, again, one of my most favorite things to talk about. So I would definitely welcome any sort of questions or feedback that you have from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to do the clap here, over here.
Thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. We have a couple of questions in the chat. I'm going to read the questions out or the comments, and then the person can come on camera as well and maybe clarify anything as you answer the question. So the first one is from Karian Sweeney. This is a question for later probably. So, but I was wondering if you have read The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and if so, what your thoughts are on it. I also agree with your stance on ACEs.
So thank you for that question. I have read that book and I really enjoy it. It's one of those where I think it has made the science of adversity and resilience more accessible to people, because it talks about the research that goes into trauma and resilience without using all of that technical jargon that usually blocks people from being able to incorporate that information into their daily lives. So I love that book. I think that Dr. van der Kolk is a great writer. I think he's a great speaker. I am a big fan of that book.
All right. Then we have a question from Ian Carmichael. Are ACEs known have a significant impact on sleep? I've read about the value of sleep and in relation to things like memory and emotional regulation. So it seems intuitive to me that negatively impacted sleep might be related to these ACE symptoms.
So I'm not very familiar about sleep research. However, I would bet a lot of money to say that there is a direct correlation between ACEs or just general trauma and sleep. We know that trauma in adults can lead to PTSD, which is going to inherently involve some sleep difficulties. I would also argue that we could see ACEs as being the exact same situation. We know that when the brain has experienced trauma, we have a very hard time kind of maintaining a sense of homeostasis because our brains are always just on such high alert. And so I would definitely think that there would be a link there.
Right. Then we have a question by Kenneth McLaughlin. Does trauma-informed care mitigate ACEs outcomes?
Yes. So the very short answer is yes, they do. This is still something that isn't super heavily researched, but there is a pretty broad consensus that when you incorporate trauma-informed care, whatever that is going to improve outcomes. We know that teachers who go through a trauma-informed care training are more likely to have positive relationships with students. Those students are less likely to have discipline referrals. We know that I've read some research how there are like programs for people who have been in the prison system, where if they incorporate trauma-informed care into those programs, they are less likely to have recidivism or go back to prison. So on basically every level that I have read about, trauma-informed care is going to definitely help mitigate the effects of ACEs.
Right. And we have a question from Jane Mutoni. Any gender differences observed on how boys, girls experience and deal with trauma in schools? I know it may not have been your focus, just in case you have anything on this.
So there are actually some gender differences. First, we also know that girls and women are more likely to report more ACEs than boys and men. However, this could just be due to socio-cultural factors that maybe discourage men from talking about these topics. So that's something we have to keep in mind. We know things like sexual abuse are more likely to occur in girls. Doesn't mean that they don't occur in boys, but more common in girls. When it comes to the effect of ACEs, girls are more likely to have internalized symptoms, so they might be more likely to develop depression, anxiety, things of that nature. Boys are also more likely to develop those, but they are more likely to show maybe more aggression. They're more likely to be a bit more combative than girls are. And so even though they might experience the same adversity, they might react to it in wildly different ways. And so that's why there's sometimes a discrepancy between um, why some behaviors are detected more quickly than others, and why some behaviors are more punished than others. Like a boy who goes to school and is just angry all the time, more likely to get suspended than a girl who is dealing with anxiety in a classroom.
Mhm. There is one question by Faith here. Is trauma sometimes one can get over?
So that's a really good question. And I would say, like getting over trauma, I kind of take that to mean, it no longer affects you. I would say it depends. Like people can certainly grow out of trauma. They can, go to therapy. They can do all of these things to help mitigate those effects themselves. It may not affect them as strongly, but I do think it is still one of those things that they carry with you. Just like in that book, The Body Keeps the Score, your body still remembers what happens, even if you think it doesn't really affect you all that much. So that's kind of the insidious nature of trauma, is just it could have happened when you were an infant and it's still affecting you all the way up through your death. And so that's kind of why this is such a serious topic to discuss.
Mhm. We have a question from Susie Marshall. Please, could you explain a little more how compassionate teaching practice develops resilience?
Yeah, so compassionate teaching practices are really embedded in this idea of just being a good social support network for students. Um, because a lot of the literature indicates that resilience is really built through those strong, positive, stable relationships. And so compassionate teaching practices is kind of a paradigm shift to help make those relationships stronger, more stable, just overall more helpful for everyone involved.
Mhm. So we have a bigger question now that I'm going to ask George to ask on camera. So George, whenever you're ready.
Hey, can you hear me? Is that
Yes.
okay? Yeah. Just first off, thank you for that talk, Chelsea. I found it
Thank
really, really
you.
interesting. So my question sort of speaks to when Felicity et al. Did their first original study. One of the adverse childhood experiences that they found, if my memory serves me correctly, was poverty in itself. So I was wondering what you thought about how intrinsically interdisciplinary trauma-informed care had to be.
So that's a really good question. So we know, so going back to the original Felicity study, they didn't specifically look at poverty, although we can see a lot of correlations. We know that there are correlations between being in a low poverty environment and maybe having a caregiver who's incarcerated. So that is kind of something that they maybe didn't directly study, but other studies definitely have. And so now it's thought of that living in poverty or living in a lower socioeconomic status household, that in itself could maybe be considered an ACE. So just due to the nature of trauma and how many social networks that we have to deal with as humans, I think that for trauma informed care to be implemented in the best way possible, you really have to implement it at every single level, not just classrooms, but doctors' offices. It could be government offices. I know going to the DMV in the United States is a very stressful experience because it's not exactly the most trauma informed area that you can possibly go to. Something as simple as a grocery store having appropriate signage to tell you where you're supposed to go and how you're supposed to like progress through the store, that in itself is trauma informed care. And so I would argue that every single institution, every single environment that we find ourselves in should incorporate these practices. It may look different depending on the level, but they're all towards this goal of promoting resilience, making people just more comfortable in their environment and promoting those strong social support networks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the answer.
Thank you. Right, there is, I think there's another comment by Jessie. I don't know if Jessie wants to come on camera and just maybe explain. Hello.
Hi, my name is Jessie. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm an Erasmus Mundus postgrad at the University of Glasgow. I study adult education for social change, and my dissertation is kind of a focus on an autoethnographic experience as a disabled woman during the COVID-19 ongoing pandemic. So something that I push for in my work is a concept of trauma-informed care that includes the lens of ableism, which I think is often missed when talking about intersectional oppressive factors, both culturally, and this is interculturally. I have a North American accent, but I've been raised in North America, here in Europe, and in Japan when I was young. So I have always been interested in trauma-informed kind of empowering spaces that allow people to come to them with everything that they are and are experiencing, but to take that burden off of them individually by empowering them through naming these systems. So I guess it might have been more of a comment, but I was finding myself drawn to that sixth pillar you mentioned, because I do think that that's a very, very important aspect of decolonial kind of deconstruction of what is very often under discussed.
100%.
But I guess.
Yeah, exactly. We know that discrimination can take probably a million different forms very easily. So I think that when we focus on that sixth pillar, it is very easy to think of, oh, well, we're talking about sexism, we're talking about misogyny, we're talking about welcoming LGBTQ plus individuals, but then we tend to forget things, about things like ableism. We tend to forget about things like ageism. We tend to not think about things like, I think about the movement towards the encompassing neurodiversity, that sort of movement that has taken off in the past couple of years. And so we're still working on kind of coming up with this unified language to work with and this unified paradigm to work with, because when we think of diversity, I would argue that most people think of race, gender, and sexual identity. And then it's kind of like, there's other things, but we don't really think about those too often. And so it is really important to bring all of those other isms and ists and phobias into the forefront, because if we don't talk about them, then we can't address them fully. So thank you for your comment. That is 100% in line with what I think and what I would like to see in the hopefully near future, us talking about that more.
But thank you. And I did have one follow-up, just where do you see the spaces where, I know you mentioned that there's a gap in the research to discuss, oh goodness gracious me, I'm having a blank because I'm speaking in front of everyone. So I'll just message you afterwards about a gap in the research that you mentioned that I found really interesting.
That's perfect.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It's fine. Thank you, Jessie, for your comment. And there are no other comments or questions at the moment in the chat. It's also 1 minute to 5, so we're getting to the end of this seminar. I would like, in the name of all of here, to thank you very much for your talk, for sharing your insights, and as always, we will put the record of this, recording of this on the Tile Network website and all the slides as well. All right. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
Going to stop the recording now.
Thank you.